Dr. David Ludwig, welcome to the show.
Great. We've been planning this for a while, and I'm happy to be with you today.
Finally roped you in. So I'm really happy to speak with you. You're a renowned professor of pediatrics at a Harvard Medical School and Boston's Children's Hospital. So you spent decades studying diet composition, specifically around carbohydrates and insulin, how it affects metabolism, weight, chronic disease. And you're the author of the New York Times bestseller, Always Hungry. So I want to start off with just giving us a very high-level overview of this carbohydrate-insulin model of obesity, because you've been one of the leading proponents of this model and you've written a lot about it. So tell us, what is it that we're dealing with here with this model?
Great. Well, let's step back and look at the big picture, which is that over the last 60 years, prevalence of obesity has continued to go up year after year, despite intensive, pervasive focus on body weight and calorie restriction, which has been the primary approach based on the conventional model of obesity. We'll talk about that. And so, it's incumbent upon a field when a problem central to its purview is not just being successfully addressed, but is worsening over time, to ask fundamental questions. Do we have the right basic model of the disease? If we don't, using the wrong model, even harder, is not going to take us anywhere. So this is a time-honored tradition, which is to ask questions about basic assumptions. Mm-hmm. So the basic assumption that has guided obesity treatment for a century is that the problem is due to overeating. Taking in too many calories with respect to your energy expenditure creates a positive energy balance. Those calories build up in the bloodstream. They get forced into fat cells, making them anabolic, making them grow. We gain weight, and over time develop obesity. Mm-hmm. So it's the overeating that is driving weight gain, fat deposition, and obesity. And there have been many views as to why people are eating too much. We know that it's not just genetics. Certainly genetics can play a role, but the obesity epidemic has evolved much too quickly for that. We know that there are environmental and dietary factors. And the latest iteration of this is that the diet is just too palatable, hyper palatable. It's excessively tasty, which is undermining our ability consciously and subconsciously to control food intake. And therefore, we're just sort of, victims of this environment, suffering inevitably weight gain. So this is what's been called the energy balance model. Overeating drives obesity. But there are, some fundamental problems with this. One is the utter failure of solutions based on the energy balance model, calorie-restricted diets, changing and a variety of other aspects of the diet to get us to eat less, failure of those approaches to stem the obesity epidemic. And there's some conceptual concerns. We call them, you can be called anomalies, which is that why is it that, we're now maybe 30 pounds, 35 pounds heavier than we were 50 or 60 years ago? Why is it that if you take an individual, and this has been done in classic studies, and reduce their weight by 30 or 35 pounds to a level that would be commensurate with what it was 50 or 60 years ago, that individual shows the hallmarks of extreme starvation, exacerbation of hunger, dropping metabolic rate, and neuroendocrine responses that indicate that the body is fighting back against that lower body weight, even though it was the same as people would have happily maintained a level before the epidemic. And conversely, the process of developing obesity is very small, is very small on a daily basis of energy balance. Energy gap, an energy discrepancy of 15 to 25 calories a day. So basically a teaspoon or two of sugar is the excess calorie deposition that explains obesity in most people, development of obesity by middle age.
So it just
Even if,
accumulates over time, over long periods of time, this small calorie surplus every day.
correct. Yeah. So even if this were subconscious as well as conscious drives to cause us to overeat, why is it so hard to compensate for that with conscious control? I mean, of course, adults control themselves all the time around all sorts of conscious and subconscious temptations, gambling, alcohol, we control our sexual behavior, all sorts of ways that, adults are capable of doing that. Why are we so exquisitely unable to manage such a small gap? So to address these apparent anomalies, another radically different model, which actually is as old as the energy balance model, but just less well known, has resurfaced. And one version of that is called the carbohydrate-insulin model. And it takes the opposite view of cause and effect. It says that overeating is not driving weight gain. The process of gaining weight, of depositing too much fat, is driving the excess, is driving the positive calorie balance. So to say a little bit more about that, something has triggered adipose tissue to take in and hold on to too many calories. So there are too few calories for the rest of the body. The brain perceives that. The brain perceives that there aren't enough calories remaining in the bloodstream after a meal. And it responds as the brain is evolved to do, which is to get us to eat more, both to get hungry, to have less satiety, and to achieve greater reward from eating foods to compensate for those calories that are being sequestered in fat. And while this may sound radical, it's actually perfectly consistent with a range of other physiological and pathological states of growth. Think of the adolescent growth spurt. The teenager is, consuming hundreds, if not 1,000 calories more a day than he or she would have in earlier childhood, and is growing really rapidly. But is the overeating, so to speak, making the adolescent grow, or is the process of depositing those calories into new body tissue for growth making the adolescent hungry and eat more? Of course, it's the opposite. It's the second one, because neither you or I will grow any taller no matter how much we eat. The same is true for the positive calorie balance in pregnancy. It's not that the overeating makes the fetus grow. It's the fetus growth that drives the mother to eat more. And a third example is a massive lipoma. A lipoma is usually a benign tumor of fat cells where they can grow and they can become enormous, many kilos. Again, it's not the positive energy balance that's making the lipoma grow, although, of course, if you starve yourself, you could perhaps restrain its growth. It's the growth of the lipoma that's making you hungry. And so that's the carbohydrate-insulin model. I think it doesn't violate any law of thermodynamics. And to just tie it all back together, the mechanism is postulated to be the increase in intake of processed called high glycemic load carbohydrates, which we ate a lot more of during the low-fat era when we were targeting the most energy-dense nutrient, fat. According to the energy balance model, fat is the big problem, or it used to be, because it's the most energy-dense nutrient. So the first food guide pyramid put all fats on the top, a range of fast-digesting high glycemic load carbohydrates at the bottom. Nutrition researchers at the time said this is going to spontaneously cause people to eat less and prevent obesity. The opposite happened. So according to the carbohydrate-insulin model, this was all predictable. The increased insulin secretion in response to these fast-digesting carbohydrates is driving fat storage. This is endocrinology 101. You give an animal insulin, it's going to get hungry, eat more, and gain weight. And even if you restrict calories so that the insulin-treated animal doesn't eat more, it still gains excessive fat because that insulin is altering substrate partitioning. It's causing more of the calories to wind up in fat cells and fewer in lean tissue. That's the carbohydrate-insulin model. It's a very clean debate. Overeating causes obesity versus the opposite. The process of becoming fat drives overeating. It's an interesting debate. Unfortunately, the two sides oftentimes talk past each other. The definitive studies have yet to be done, and this debate has paralyzed a topic that I address in a new paper that's just coming out today in Cell Metabolism.
Yeah, I think that's just fascinating. You're really talking about reversing the direction, the causality, this fat storage driving sort of the hunger and the overeating on just small scales every day, right? Not a huge amount of calories, like you said, just 10 to 15 calories a day. What's fascinating to me is that there are such strong views on this on the opposite side, on both sides of this debate. And Kevin Hall, John Speakman, folks like those who are really more on this side of the energy balance model. And of course, if they were here, they would have probably more to say to try to defend that model. But I think the point that you raise is really, I think, important. And in your paper that's out today in Cell Metabolism is talking about how do we get past this impasse of really, it's a miscommunication, oftentimes ad hominem attacks, especially in the social media world, which is incentivized to drive polarization in general. But even among scientists, you have these scientists who are very well respected in their fields who are on different sides of this issue, and we have not made much progress. We have not come together. One of the things that I really admire about folks who want to get to the truth of things is that they will work together with people they disagree with. And that's not always easy, but I think there's something about including people with different perspectives in a study or in a manuscript that helps balance out biases and helps get closer to maybe the middle ground of what is agreed upon. I know you've started, in the AJCN, you started this sort of special series about great debates in nutrition, which kind of attempts to do this, right? It's like bring together these authors on different sides of an issue. They'll each make their case. They'll kind of come together, talk about what they agree about and what they don't agree about. So can you, at a high level, give us an overview of this new paper where you're kind of saying, here's the new way forward. Here's how we can kind of get past this impasse that we're at.
Right. Well, thank you. So the new paper looks at polarization and paralysis across the field of nutrition from the perspective of a famous science philosopher, Thomas Kuhn. He was a brilliant man who anticipated all of the difficulties that we in nutrition and many fields experience, although I argue that it's probably worse in nutrition for a variety of reasons. When we try to expand the field to consider radical different hypotheses. And there is, he proposed a sort of a cycle that science doesn't advance in linear steps, as we oftentimes think of it. He describes different stages. They're almost quantum leaps. Most of the time, scientists work in what he calls normal science, where you have an established model. Everybody thinks that the model is basically correct. And the effort in the field isn't to ask foundational questions about the model. Did we get it right? Could we be blinded to something? But it's instead to incrementally expand the model and understand it more and apply it to different areas. That's a perfectly legitimate stage of science. Is very important. Many exciting things can happen, can be very powerful. But inevitably, according to Kuhn, normal science sows the seeds of its own demise. Because as you continue to dive deeper and deeper into a paradigm, eventually you begin to see discrepancies, ways in which nature does not conform to the model. Models are never completely correct. They're always wrong, as one famous science philosopher said, a statistician, but they may be useful. And so as we get deeper and deeper into a model, we begin to see discrepancies. And that tends to lead to revisions of the model. The model kind of continues to try to adapt and change. to accommodate these discrepancies, but that eventually fundamental anomalies that can't be reconciled emerge. And it causes people to say, wait a second, maybe we've made some major mistakes in our fundamental assumptions. And only at that time can radical new models that ask basic questions be considered seriously. But when that happens, there is oftentimes intense pushback. People who's based their careers for 30, 40, 50 years on the conventional model say, what is this? How can these people be questioning these basic assumptions? This is nonsense. Let's just, we have some problems, we have some unanswered questions, but that doesn't mean our assumptions are wrong. We just need to do more work. And this can battle out. Kuhn points out that oftentimes we know that challenges to an accepted model are not always right. In fact, most challenges are going to be wrong, but occasionally they're going to be right. And if we suppress new ideas, we can inhibit scientific advancement. And I think that I use this clash between obesity models as a case study to see how things can actually go wrong.
Yeah. And I think you do a very good job of presenting the issue in a fair, balanced way. And I think that's impressive coming from somebody who's sort of, you're on the, maybe this is sort of the minority view at this point, right? You're saying it's not necessarily the mainstream, but you're coming at this from a perspective where you say, I want to see this. I want to see us reach some consensus. I think you have some major critiques and you obviously are of the opinion that you have some very important nuance to add and a paradigm shift to the actual thinking of obesity, right? And the main causes, which I know there are many. So it's also possible that there's kind of a mix of different causes going on here. But there's been two highly cited clinical trials, which you mentioned in this paper, on the debate of sort of the energy balance model or carbohydrate-insulin model. And they've been publicly available data. Even the questions seem straightforward, yet we don't really have agreement. So can you talk about what happened in these studies and why is it that sort of a resolution or some sort of consensus around this issue has been so elusive?
Great. Let me, to answer that question again, step back a little bit. And I'd like to propose 3 hallmarks of a healthy scientific discipline. And we can use these as criteria to question, how well we're doing in nutrition. So the first is that the field is able to support constructive dialogue between opponents on critical questions of science and public health, that the debates are held in a responsible way, strictly without ad hominem, because ad hominem erodes the foundations of trust that are needed for people to think differently and to collaborate, to work together. So, can we hold constructive debates among radically different ideas? Second, for debates that are for which answers are elusive, is the field leading us to doing the definitive studies? Are the authorities, the leadership, defining what will be definitive kinds of research, and helping the field design those studies and get them funded and get them done? And thirdly, we alluded to this, are we solving fundamental problems? In the case of nutrition, there's no problem that is worse than the epidemics of diet-related chronic disease. And we're at risk of abdicating our responsibility to finding dietary cures over to the pharmaceutical industry and saying, all right, it'll be GLP-1 agonists that ultimately solve this. And I think that you can tell that I'm implying that it's hard to give high marks on any of these 3 criteria. And the topic that you raise, constructive debate, is very illustrative of the problem. We have 2 major studies. One from my group, we published in BMJ in 2018. It was one of the largest feeding studies ever done of macronutrients. We took 164 adults with high BMI in by feeding them everything that they consume, brought their weight down by 10%, which we know will cause neuroendocrine adaptations that antagonize weight loss, slowing metabolic rate, increasing hunger. And then we randomly assign them to one of three diets with 20, 40, or 60% carbohydrate, 60, 40, or 20% fat, and fed them for an additional 5 months. We then measured total energy expenditure by doubly labeled water. The primary outcome was that energy expenditure at weight loss maintenance, so we locked body weight, was 200 to 300 kcals a day faster, higher energy expenditure on the low versus the high carbohydrate diet. So this questions a fundamental premise of the energy balance model that all calories are metabolically alike. The two diets with the same calories should produce the same weight loss or weight gain or weight maintenance. So this was published in BMJ. It became their most highest metrics paper of the year, so it got some attention. And the opponents of the model quickly did some reanalysis. We put all of the data, perhaps for the first time for a nutrition study like this, publicly available. And they said, wait a second, no, this is false. You didn't show that. This is an artifact of a mathematical quirk of doubly labeled water, where if you are non-compliant to the diets, you're going to affect respiratory quotient. That's reflecting how much carbohydrate or fat that's being burned. That's used in the equations. And if people are non-compliant, it could make it look like their energy expenditure is higher, but it's not really. So that's what they published. And there were a few other attacks on the paper as part of that letter in International Journal of Obesity. We were fortunately able to, given an opportunity to respond, and also in another paper in European Journal of Clinical Nutrition, we said, no, we've reanalyzed your reanalysis, and you're making statistical errors. They made simple statistical errors. They did post-hoc exclusions. I won't go through that. All the data are publicly available. But I said, we said, no, the paper remains valid. So that's sitting there. One side says the paper is invalid. The other side says invalid. It's got major implications to the foundations of obesity pathophysiology, but it's just sitting there. The field is sort of watching this as if it were a cage fight from the distance, but not helping to resolve this conflict. So let's reverse that. So then in 2021, proponents of the energy balance model published a 2-week crossover feeding study with 20 adults, given either an animal-based ketogenic diet, so very low carb, animal-based, versus a plant-based high carbohydrate diet. I'm not sure why they did the animal versus plant comparison there, but that's what they did. And their primary outcome, so this was a residential feeding study, 2 weeks, and then a crossover to the other done for another 2 weeks without a washout period, which is a key issue in a crossover trial because you could have carryover effects. And so the primary outcome there was that people ate a lot more, about 500 calories a day on the low-carb diet than the low-fat diet, and that was interpreted as a fatal threat, fatal attack on the carbohydrate-insulin model. We pointed out at the time that over 2 weeks, the effects seemed to be attenuating, and 2 weeks is too short. You have to adapt to the diets. But it turned out subsequently that there was a carryover effect. That's where the effect of one diet bleeds over into the other. And so you could be blaming one diet due to the previous diet's actions or getting credit for one diet from the previous diet's actions. And that this carryover effect was probably, we argue, the largest ever seen in the field of nutrition. Not 500 calories a day as the primary putative effect. It was like 2,000 calories a day. they don't make carryover effects that big. And so we argued that this completely invalidates the study based on stats 101 kinds of reasonings. And a variety of other statisticians have weighed in. The first author of the study responded by saying basically that the primary analysis, the pre-specified primary analysis, involved addressing the data this way, and that if we tried to address the carryover effect, it could itself incorporate new kinds of bias, which is true. There's no good way to address a carryover effect once it's happened, which is why authors across the board have been saying we need washout periods to prevent carryover effects. But just because there's no good way to address it doesn't mean that the study is valid. So we've got this, again, sitting there. The paper is in one of the best journals of the field, Nature Medicine, and it's still influencing clinical care. It's being highly cited. If those data are fundamentally unreliable, why is the paper still sitting there? So the field needs to answer these questions. All of the data are publicly available, or most of them, and the questions are really straightforward.
Yeah, I think this is just so, tricky to see when you're an outside observer and you see these different labs publishing seemingly contradictory findings and not agreeing on each other's analyses. It's hard to really make sense of it, right? It's hard to understand. It's easy to say, well, it's all just noise. Who knows what's going on? But I have one question.
Well, I think that's a critical issue. So some of these are admittedly technical expert kinds of questions that involve statistics, doubly labeled water, and other aspects of. But that's why you have experts in the field. We can't expect the general, educated scientists to be able to distinguish the strength of these arguments. But there is certainly plenty of expertise in the field from people not engaged in this debate to sort this through and to make a determination over which side is right, because both sides can't be. These are mutually exclusive possibilities. And I argue it's an abdication of the responsibility of the field itself to make a determination on such critical and resolvable scientific problems, especially when all the data, or most of it again, is publicly available.
I think there's a few points here I want to raise. So the first is that there are single studies that can seemingly contradict each other, and I think that is sometimes confusing. So, for example, there was a randomized controlled trial in Japan that looked at the eating rate of sort of the ultra-processed diets versus unprocessed diets, and found the eating rate was about twice as fast on the ultra-processed diet, twice as many chews. But in other studies, the one that Kevin Hall is sort of in process of conducting and analyzing, they found no difference between the rate of chews between those types of diets. And I think there's a lot of nuance sometimes of the study design itself and the decision made by researchers, intentional or not, that can sometimes affect things. And so one of the ways that I think the reason that a lot of science is sort of starts scratching the surface into truth or understanding, it takes a long time to develop a body of evidence where you have lots of randomized controlled trials that are then meta-analyzed and all of that. I wanted to ask you specifically about your study in 2018 that you mentioned, because you've been critical of sort of the short-term period of the trials. And of course, the washout period. I think the washout period, that's a very valid criticism. On the short-term nature, I have two questions. One is, with your study in 2018, did you see the advantages of the low-carb diet to reduced calorie intake in the first 2 weeks? Was there a way to analyze that within the first 2 weeks? You said it went, I think, 5 or 6 months overall.
Yeah. So let me answer that question, but first say you're absolutely right. There are many, many studies that could be perfectly well conducted, but just are not definitive due to the nature of a complex challenge. We can look at different parts of the elephant, and it may take many, many studies to get a big picture. What I was talking about before is not in that category. These are specific, definitive, and resolvable scientific questions. Does a carryover effect invalidate the findings from a trial, especially when it's so large? Or in the case of our study, could non-compliance have explained the findings of an increase in energy expenditure? These are answerable questions. Now, going back to the 2018 study and the question you asked, we don't argue that the study's answering everything. Now, we monitored food intake, and in fact, we published another paper in Journal of Nutrition that showed if people are actually burning 200 or 300 calories more a day on one diet and we're maintaining them at the same body weight, we're locking that, then we should have to give them 200 or 300 calories more to do that. Otherwise, there is something that doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that's in fact what we saw, that in order to maintain weight at that reduced level, we had to feed people on the low-calorie diet 200 or 300 calories a day. Now, there was a lot of individual noise because intakes go up and down, and you can have fluctuations in body weight that have nothing to do with energy balance, such as water. But overall, that's what we saw with a high level of statistical confidence. We didn't have the technical ability to distinguish what was happening in the first week for the second week versus the third week. But the Nature Medicine study with the carryover effect does that very well because people were maintained under constant observation. And in the original paper, they reported this. The paper that reported the 500 calorie increase on the low carb diet of calorie intake, suggesting that they're just hungrier and they're eating more. That effect weaned with an extremely high level of statistical confidence. I think they reported that the linear trend toward extinguishing that effect was less than 0.0001. So we know that this, based on fundamental mechanisms that have been known for many decades, that it takes time to adapt to a low-carb diet. If you take people on a usual diet, or if you've put them first on a high-carb diet, which is why we get these carryover effects, and you suddenly turn off the carbohydrate supply, the brain panics because the ketones take a couple of weeks to reach steady state. It may take longer to get transporters and other fine-tuning changes in metabolism.
Right.
So you cut off the glucose supply because you're giving them a ketogenic diet. The ketones that would feed the brain are not yet at steady state. So what's going to happen? You're going to get hungry. The brain is going to say, we're not feeding the body properly. I don't have enough fuel. Eat more. And also, it causes people to feel physically bad. It reduces their physical activity. They tend to develop what's called the keto flu. But these are transient effects. They have nothing to do with how these diets affect body weight and diabetes, other chronic diseases over the long term.
I have an idea, David. What if we find a statistician that is independent from either group, and you and the leader of the other paper, which I think was Kevin Hall, if I'm not mistaken, you work with a statistician you publish a paper working on both of these studies, and you try to do the analysis in the most considering both perspectives. I guess this comes down to something that I think your article today really mentions, which is this incommensurability. And there's this idea that we have competing paradigms, and the people who are proponents of these paradigms or who really understand them or are key in developing them, they're essentially working in different worlds. And you said this thing of talking past each other, which I think is happening. How do we stop the talking past each other and talk to each other to resolve? Because I think what you're saying here in this specific case of these two trials, yours in 2018 in the BMJ, and then the Nature Medicine one in 2021, how can you actually answer the question if the data are there and it's sort of a disagreement about how do you analyze the data and how do you understand the science and the evidence, right?
Yeah. Well, let me. So the paper is actually going to be open access for 30 days. I know you'll probably post a link to the paper. And what I did was, include 6 quotes from Thomas Kuhn's book. He wrote the book in the 1960s. The second edition came out. So I have a box here which has some quotes on this issue of incommensurability, meaning the difficulty of both sides in a paradigm clash to speak to each other. And I just like to read one, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
It's what you started. The proponents of competing paradigms practice their trades in different worlds. Both are looking at the world, and what they look at has not changed. But in some areas, they see different things, and they see them different relationship one to the other. That is why a law that cannot even be demonstrated to one group of scientists may occasionally seem intuitively obvious to another. And that's the problem we're dealing with. We're all wearing the lens of our paradigm. Paradigms come with lenses, and that lens can be filtering out critical wavelengths of information. So the first thing we need to do is have some humility that our paradigm, even as we advocate for it vigorously, that is probably not completely correct. And another key point I make, which I give some historical examples of where this goes wrong, is the tendency of ad hominem to infuse these debates, to poison these debates. It poisons the well of trust that both sides are going to have to overcome this this gap in communication. And social media is full of ad hominem and attacks and nastiness, going back and forth. But I really expect that people in our field, if you have an academic appointment, if you're a physician who's advocating or a nutritionist who's teaching, addressing chronic disease either in the laboratory or in the clinic, we really have to refrain from this nonsense. And I've just been shocked at how frequent even full professors of the equivalent engage in nastiness online and sometimes at scientific meetings. This should not be normalized. It happens in politics where we demonize the opponent, and look where we are as a country. But this may happen in the sandbox in second grade, but it cannot be allowed to happen. And I think that this is one of my greatest disappointments in the field of nutrition, that the field has not taken a more rigorous stance in pushing back. And we have to push back our own sides. It's not enough for, like the folks in the carbohydrate-insulin model to tell the folks in the energy balance model, stop attacking me, or the opposite. Each side has to police itself. And ultimately, we need to develop that British tradition. I don't know if it was really true, but, you'd go to the debate hall, you'd argue, you'd yell, you'd say the other person's, arguing nonsense, and then you'd put your arms around each other afterward and go out for a beer. So you can have a sharp intellectual contrast, but you don't attack the person specifically. And until that's resolved, I think your great ideas of working together and designing productive adversarial collaborations are going to be fraught.
Right. You have to have this. It also has to be people have to buy into this from both sides of the issues, right? You can't just have one side of the debate say we're gonna police ourselves and make sure that we don't do ad hominem attacks. We keep it to the content. The other side has to do that too. And what you're calling for is like, let's do this as a community of nutrition scientists, medical practitioners, doctors, public health experts. We should not devolve into second grade playground or 2-year-old playground scuffs. I think it's a shame too. I've been disappointed by that. I typically, one thing I appreciate about you is that I have never seen you engage in those types of ad hominem attacks, and you've been very vocal about disagreements. You think that certain papers, analyses are incorrect, but you do it with respect. And I hope that others can kind of model that. Hopefully that's an example.
Well, thank you, Ty. And let's just remember what we're dealing with. And those of us who are clinicians, and I have been graced to be able to have sat with thousands of patients with, obesity and other chronic diseases, but we're reminded of this regularly. We're talking about tremendous
Mhm.
human suffering, diseases that are increasingly robbing even adolescents of not just the length, but the quality of their lives. This is tragic. We have to work together. We haven't solved the problem. The insurgents, and I'm, admittedly among the insurgents, I'm coming in and saying, wait a second, you guys, you don't have it all right. We need to reassess some basic assumptions, and that's not always comfortable. But I'm willing to acknowledge that I don't have it all right, and that we do have to work together if we're going to do a better job of confronting these epidemics of chronic disease. And who knows, maybe we can be a model for politicians in Washington, although that would be a
One can hope.
pretty big translation. But yeah.
I think the first step, if I'm hearing you right, is that we're not at the point where there can be constructive, you called it adversarial collaboration, where you actually work with the opposing scientist on the analysis of the paper. Maybe the first step needed is to publish a joint sort of message. And I've seen this happen at rare occasions in politics where you have politicians from both sides sort of at certain times, make a statement together about the importance of unity or something like that, right? I think it doesn't have to be like that, but I think what there could be is there could be a paper similar to what you're writing, but sort of joined by authors of different debates. So this is not just about the carbohydrate-insulin model and the energy balance model. It's about, sugar versus saturated fat. It's about ultra-processed foods and NOVA system, whether that is a legitimate system or it has major problems, right? There's all sorts of these debates, and it's not just the one that we're talking about now. So I think one way forward would be to have, I would love to see this, but to sort of have the scientists who are leading these paradigms actually join together on a paper in a high impact journal to say a message of, look, we need to work together. We need to, not only that, we need to we can be passionate. We can be, like you said, in that sort of model of, in the past of, we can engage, we can criticize the actual work, we can critique it, but let's make it constructive. I think the whole point there is that if somebody truly does want to get to the bottom of what the science and the evidence is, that is the way forward. It's to say, look, we're going to have some humility. We're going to let other people kind of analyze ours, be open to feedback and criticism, and then engage and counter that, and then try to reach some sort of consensus. Do you see that as a possible way forward, where this sort of shared, if you can get the buy-in from others with opposing views, kind of publishing something like that would be any way forward? Because just so you know, like, I've experienced somewhat similar on a lower scale, but one of your close colleagues, which I respect a lot, that you and Walter Willett, who's also at Harvard, you often have some very different perspectives on things, but at the same time, you publish a lot of work together because you agree about a lot, right? And, I've worked with people like Christopher Gardner, who I'd say I have a lot of respect for, but sometimes very different views. We've worked on a paper together. I'll be actually speaking with him in person on Monday on Simon Hill's podcast to kind of go over the dietary guidelines. So that, I think, is constructive. But like even in the scientific realm, when I've published a paper or someone else has published a paper, I sometimes will write a letter to the editor and I'll raise my concerns, right? Or a group of authors will raise their concerns, similar to what you sort of expressed. And then the authors typically will come back and either counter it and say, oh, actually, that's wrong. But there's such little space involved, and it's usually, I'm very unsatisfied by the resolution. It's not a resolution. Usually it's just, oh yeah, well, that's sort of a misunderstanding of it. These are all valid and accurate. And what I would like to see is this actual joining on a study itself, because that will require actually digging deep into the issues in the science. Because you can publish with your camp, you can say whatever you want in a 500-word response to a comment, right? You can write your paper and have it say whatever you and your colleagues, one and one's colleagues think, but really having to work with somebody else, I think that it'll actually examine, okay, well, here's how we want to set up the study. Let's say it's the analysis. It may be, here's how we want to look at this analysis, right? But if it's a study starting from the scratch, you can design it in a way that both parties are happy with. And then, I'm sure people would find a way to complain about the outcome, but hopefully the outcome would be something that both parties would have to subscribe to say, look, we both had an equal say in the design of this study. We were involved in the adherence and all of this stuff. And here's what the study found, right? I'm sure there can still be some debates about the interpretation of it, but that would be a lot more constructive than these camps publishing papers back and forth, and they're just like talking past each other.
Well, I think that would be a seminal study, the one you described, which I don't want to also diminish the value of each side publishing its own papers along the way, because it takes a lot of foundation work before you can generate the consensus and and acquire the resources to do a definitive study like this, which might cost tens of millions of dollars, depending upon the question.
Mm-hmm.
So I enthusiastically support that. But even before that, we have an alternative to the 250 word. I have a letter coming out in Lancet on the recent ultra-processed food series. So they had 3, premier papers. I got 250 words to respond to that. But you lamented the 500 word letter. But there's another option, which you mentioned earlier. I'm very proud of having developed great debates in nutrition in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, whose role is specifically this. It's to support rigorous debate between identified respected opponents of opposing positions with extensive back and forth. In fact, it evolves over 3 separate papers. So anybody who wants to do this, you can get 3 for 1 if you've got a good topic, and we can put together. But we've had debates like between with a vegan versus not quite a carnivore, but somebody who is definitely arguing for plant-based diets. Now that's about as hot an explosive topic as there, but it was a perfectly fine debate. We've had debates on saturated fat, ultra-processed foods. And in fact, we have a debate that's just now finishing up between Tim Noakes and Louise Burke, who are opposing each other on whether low-carb diets are inferior for sports performance. So do you need to eat a high-carb diet for optimal sports performance? We're just finishing that up. But, this is a chance to do that. And I invite your viewers to contact me if they have any topics of debate. But that the study that you're talking about on a variety of debates should be done. But those are going to take a lot of groundwork and a lot of money.
And I've seen actually an idea. I think this was by ASN. So ASN is the American Society for Nutrition, which is the sort of where AJCN, the journal you're talking about that you're an editor at, fits in. And they've attempted this idea of adversarial collaboration with funders, where you can even have funders that are kind of on opposing sides. I think that the funders there's a role to play. You've mentioned this as well, where professional societies like ASN, but also the funders have a responsibility to potentially, I think, enforce or require more collaboration, more adversarial type of research. Because if the funder is holding the control over who gets funds, why not make it a requirement to include somebody from the opposing side, that they have some power.
It's a powerful lever when your funding is contingent, especially in an environment with, diminishing independent funding, that if future funding is dependent upon you playing nicely in the sandbox with your opponent, we might really have a strong incentive to do so.
Yeah, well, any of the donors or funders listening, please take this seriously, because I think that could make a difference. I think as much as I would love to see people out of the goodness of their hearts voluntarily signing up to work with people they disagree with, I don't think it's the norm. Like you said, it's quite rare to do that. So I think that donors, funders have a big role to play. The societies, the journals that you're talking about, that can help the culture of sort of nutrition science in general, or the health field as well, be a bit more collaborative and seeking the truth. I mean, I hate to say that word, but I think that if we're looking for what's real, what does the evidence say, we should be open to that, even if our career we have been within one paradigm. I really admire the folks that can sort of shift and say, well, now that we have the evidence, I actually have shifted my perspective as that new evidence has come in. So we've talked about some of the next steps. Now, if we're getting back to this before we close, because I know we're about out of time here, but if we're getting back to the carbohydrate-insulin model versus the energy balance model of obesity, and you talked about maybe if there is a single definitive study, what would it look like? You've been critical of the wash in, wash out effects, the short-term nature. Of course, the funding is a challenge, but can you just give an example for us, for the viewers, sort of what would it look like to sort of set up a study that helps answer this debate?
Well, all right. So let me answer that and restate the problem with these very short studies, anything less than a month. We know what the answer is before the study's done. So there's no point in doing it. The low-carb diet's going to look bad. For a population that's consuming high-carbohydrate diets, that's where we get our recruitments for these studies. They're adapted to high-carbohydrate diets, anything more than 40% or 30%. The brain is primarily dependent upon glucose. And you put them on a low-carb diet, the low-carb diet will look bad for several weeks, up to a month. Don't bother with the study. I give it to you. You win on that. There's nothing to be learned. And arguably, and Gary Taubes went through this recently in a Substack, those studies are unethical. Studies that cost money and require people's efforts when we already know the outcome, and it's unlikely to be informative of long-term mechanisms, those are not worth doing. So we have to figure out a way to do longer studies if we're going to ask fundamental mechanistic questions that aren't confounded by these transient epiphenomena. So unless you're studying the process of transitioning, adaptation, then you can do a short-term study. If it's specifically looking at how the body adapts, sure. But if you're trying to ask what diet is better for chronic diseases, and that Nature Medicine study, focused on models of obesity pathogenesis. So that's a chronic question. Let's not do short studies. How long do you need to go? It depends on what the outcome is. But I think we're looking at least months. And so if we're going to then try to achieve very high rigor and control over diets to ask metabolic questions, then we need creative designs. Back in Ansel Keys' days, he could basically institutionalize conscientious objectors from the war and starve them over many months. And there were clearly ethical issues with that. But today, I think we can do these kinds of studies, especially not starvation studies, but studies of people eating, controlled diets in institutionalized settings, be it boarding schools, maybe even prisons with proper ethical protection, or the military, boot camps and the like. I think we can find situations where we can maintain excellent oversight and control of diet for many months at a time, at a cost that isn't going to be financially overwhelming, and hope to get definitive answers to the questions that have been debated in some ways without much change over a century.
Yeah, I hope to see it happen. I hear you. The longer term is necessary for this particular issue. I have one final question I really want to know your opinion on. You probably saw last year in Nature Medicine a paper by Samuel Dickens and others that was a randomized trial in a sort of real world example of people having to change their diets at home, but over many months. And the kind of high level two groups were a quote healthy ultra processed diet, so something that adhered to sort of dietary guidelines in the UK, but was predominantly ultra processed foods. And the other group was this minimally processed, unprocessed type diet that also aligned with dietary guidelines. Now, both groups lost weight, consumed fewer calories from baseline, but the unprocessed or minimally processed diet group lost far less, substantially less. And one of your criticisms of the sort of short-term trials when you look at now for examining, for example, the Kevin Hall study from 2019, when you look over 2 weeks, you see a big gap in energy consumption, right, and in weight gain. But you pointed out that that difference starts lessening and it starts converging closer and closer to zero. So my question for you is, with this study in Nature Medicine by Samuel Dickens last year, does that, to your to your criticism, does that address any of that, or are you still sort of concerned with that in terms of the ultra processed, unprocessed food debate?
Well, yes, I am aware of it, and I actually have a paper in Nature Medicine, Matters Arising, it's like a glorified letter to the editor on that study, and I wrote it with Walter Willett and a statistician named Mary Putt. So it's an 8-week study. They did have a washout period, but it's 8 weeks, so we're not talking about a very long term.
Mm-hmm.
And they had some important, and the differences in weight were not. You used a large word to describe the difference. One group lost 2% of its weight, the minimally processed diet. The other group lost 1% of its weight. So the actual difference was about a kilogram.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a trivial difference unless it accumulates over time. And there's no basis to believe, first of all, that would accumulate over time. That's what a study needs to show. We can't just extrapolate that. You can change, all sorts of things. You ask people to eat, foods that selectively eliminate one color. You have people eat in rooms with strangers. Their weight's gonna change by a kilo. I would also say that there's a big additional problem with the study, in that there was a huge imbalance in dropouts. I believe that basically all of the dropouts, all 12, occurred during or immediately after the minimally processed diet. And so to get this 1 kilogram of difference, they had to do statistical models that assume missing at random, which is not, we argue, supported.
Not a valid assumption.
That whole kilogram could just be a statistical aberration.
But I will point out the small difference that you're pointing out, that it's hard to make impacts in real world, what we call effectiveness trials, right? The trials that we were talking about previously are sort of very well controlled, so you can make sure that people eat a certain way. And so I think there's at least some of this is due to the fact that it's hard to get people to adhere very strongly over a period of time. So if there's any difference, I still take that seriously. But your point is 8 weeks, yes, a little bit of a difference, but there hasn't been long enough trial to show that would have carried on, especially if you think about the dropouts.
But more fundamentally, the statistical assumptions are not robust, we argue. And Mary Putt is a internationally recognized statistician, expert in crossover studies, and she doesn't have a dog in this fight one way or the other. But so these are again basic statistical questions. When you have 12-0 dropouts, and you're making the assumption of missing at random, that's a technical term,
Yeah.
I won't go through that, but it, if you
Missing
model
at
this,
random would assume that 6 were from one group and 6 were from the other group. Is that?
Again, it's missing at random is not meaning that it's totally random. Missing at random means that you can infer what the dropout would have looked like from available data, generally baseline covariance. But, so you can't have something that's aligned with the treatment intervention that's affecting dropouts. So if, for example, the minimally processed diet was just like less palatable, less tasty, people dropped out, the ones who were not like people who joins these kinds of studies, well, it's people who are looking to lose some weight. The participants were overweight. And so the people who, if just a few of the people who were not losing weight dropped out selectively, you've created the whole effect. It's just all factitious. Right. We don't know. So this is not, it's a study. The data are what they are, and you can have different interpretations. But this is certainly not a robust basis for international calls to reformulate the food supply based on this notion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the study, it's indicative, but it's not definitive by any means. So, okay, final question before we wrap up. Do you have anything in this topic in general? Because I know you're passionate about this paper that's out today in Cell Metabolism. You were the sole author. This is this is dear to your heart in terms of what you would like to see happen. But how do we move forward? What would you like to see? If you want to just leave the listeners and the viewers with one sort of takeaway from this conversation.
Great. Well, I would make just a few brief points. First of all, let us embrace paradigm clash as a wonderful opportunity that most scientists don't get to experience. Usually you're working within an established paradigm and you're making incremental additions, and that's fine, all well and good. But paradigm clash is a time when everything is thrown up in the air and you get to ask basic questions about assumptions and create something potentially entirely new. Now, paradigm clash may resolve in just a better understanding that the original paradigm was correct or better, and we just have to think about it a little differently. Or we may need a radical new way of thinking. This is not something that should, result in hostility and ad hominem attack. Let's embrace paradigm clash as a special opportunity that few generations of scientists get to experience. And how do we do that? Well, the first thing is to absolutely resist any urge to make it personal. Somebody might be questioning our ideas that we hold as near and dear. We're humans. We've developed our careers around proposing these ideas. We think that they're going to be transformative to public health. We care about people. And here along, this group is coming at us from left field, questioning our basic assumptions. Who are they? Well, I think we have to remember that this is fundamental to scientific advancement, and that even if we feel challenged, and it is going to feel uncomfortable, we have to attack the ideas, not the person. This is such a basic concept. Attack the ideas as vigorously, as mercilessly as you want. We need that. We need more of that. But unless there's really objective evidence that a person is taking a payoff from some for-profit firm that's benefiting from it and there's egregious misconduct, we can't assume that our opponent is operating with malicious intention. We have to assume the opponent is well-intentioned and afford them that respect. And then the last thing that Thomas Kuhn actually offers is that you assume that your opponent comes from a different, he calls it a language tribe. They speak a different language. This is the incommensurability issue. They're using words that you use differently. So you have to assume you're traveling in a foreign country and try to learn how your opponent is speaking and what they mean when they use certain words, because they're coming from a completely different vantage point. And by stretching, both sides stretching to understand what the other person could possibly be seeing that's motivating the strength of their opinion, offers a possible bridge. You know, there's one model that, this is a famous paper, that science advances one funeral at a time. Like, you probably remember that study.
Yeah.
That basically saying nobody ever changes their opinion and that the wrong ideas just have to die out. But this is a much less pessimistic view. It's suggesting that, changing your mind about fundamental things that we're attached to, including for ego reasons, careerism, professionalism, our ego, all these things, our grants, all these things. There's a lot of incentive on maintaining a mindset, but that the scientists come to the field with a basic love of the truth. And that if we find that primal motivation, we have a way of potentially getting through the ego and power and, nastiness of it all, where we can recognize our opponent is not somebody that we agree with, but a critical participant in a really special practice, the practice of the pursuit of truth through science.
Yeah. Well said. I fully agree. So, Dr. David Ludwig, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. Appreciate it.
Thank you.